Welcome everybody, both in the room and virtually. Particular thanks to those of you who are here with us who braved the weather here in Canberra to show up. We appreciate you being here. We hope to provide you a very robust discussion over the course of the next hour or so and take your questions, and then we will have time to network and chat afterward. Which you people who are joining us remotely, while we greatly appreciate you, we will miss you with the networking. My name is Amie Stepanovich. I am the Vice President for U.S. Policy at the Future of Privacy Forum. And as my title indicates, I am here to ask questions of our panelists at this great event on navigating security and safety for young Australians. It is an incredible week to be having this conversation, given all of the policy conversations that are happening here in Canberra. So it feels very timely. I don't know if we could have anticipated that when we set the date for the event, but here we are. By means of introduction, safety, security, and privacy are each independently huge areas. They could take days of discussions individually to try to just wrap your head around in a general manner. When you start talking about bringing them together, where it might seem like it could get easier, I think it even gets more complicated. So our speakers have a task in front of them as we try to tackle what are the themes between safety, security, and privacy happening today. Particularly when it's often set up that these are things that you can't all have at the same time. You're told you have to give up your data if you want to be safe online. You're told that you can have privacy, but only if you give up all of your security. It's never really positioned in a public way that you're able to have all of these things at once. But I think that we often want to have all of them at once. And so trying to figure out solutions, get to answers of ways to address all three of these giant problems in a way that's cohesive and coherent is something that we set out when we started this panel series to try to tackle. And with this last panel in our event series, the speakers will speak to all of those topics during the course of the next little bit of time. So I am now going to turn the topic over to our panelists, starting with Mandy Ross. Mandy is the Director of Strategic Partnerships for Defense at Monash University. Mandy, can you set us up and talk a bit about some of the threats that we're seeing at the intersection of privacy, security, and safety? And within your work, can you speak to some of the ways that you might see to address those threats?
Yes, thank you so much for having me on the panel today, Amie. I'm really delighted to be here. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Mandy Ross. Just to give you a little bit about my background, to give some context around this conversation. I started my career in sort of online safety and security, I guess in 2006, where I joined the United Kingdom's Centre for Online Protection, the crime agency, where we tackled sexual exploitation of young people in the online environment. And there was a real explosion of it at that time because everybody was getting smartphones, they had one in their pocket. It meant that there was a proliferation of images that were being taken of young people online, and a centre was set up to tackle that problem and bring global experts together, and I was fortunate enough to land there. There was several different faculties. I worked in harm reduction, and the pillar that centred around was education, which is seen as a norm these days, but it certainly wasn't back then. Since returning to Australia, I've worked for the Alana and Madeline Foundation, who have great credentials in running education programs in Australian schools, eSmart, and then the last one of those more recently is a program called Media Literacy Lab that tackles critical thinking. And that was funded by Google and several other things. There is a transition between me and the work that I now do for Monash in the defence space, but we don't need to talk about that today. Some of the most critical things that I guess I have seen in my career that span privacy, safety and security is exactly what Amie was talking about. So young people are especially a vulnerable population. I think we all know that. And I guess the most interesting work that I have done in that space most recently is the proliferation of mis and disinformation in our online environment. And we see that play out as adults, I guess most recently in the US election, and you probably have more of an opinion on that than I, but the polarization of our globe. And that starts, if we want to address that, we have to start to address that with our younger populations. And so I believe in the work that I've done that teaching young people critical thinking skills isn't a bolt-on. It needs to span curricula, and it should be embedded in everything that we do. So I guess I'll leave it there and we can get to more of the discussion, and I'll let the other panellists introduce themselves.
So I will turn to Ben Aw. Ben does public policy at Snap Incorporated. Thank you for joining us. In your role, you have to take these major issues and practically implement responses to them every single day. No pressure. Can you tell us a little bit about how Snap approaches the safety and well-being for youth, and particularly perhaps with regard to the existing regulatory frameworks?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and it's really great to be here and join you all this evening. It's great to be at ASPI. I actually have a kind of national security background. That's where I spent the first kind of half of my career, including in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, where I was in the team led by a then young rising star called Justin Bassey, who now runs ASPI. I've been at Snap for a year now, and it's been an interesting year, hasn't it? And I think with this week, it's what we're watching a range of bills, wind their way through Parliament in potentially the last sitting period before the election. So just a preamble to your question, I think Snap, we've really been kind of aware of that intersection that we've been talking about. It's not a balance. We don't think it's about trading off. It's about taking into account various priorities, privacy, security, safety, and finding a way to really kind of achieve really good things and good outcomes in all of them. I think Snap, we've always seen ourselves a little bit differently from traditional social media. We were designed kind of differently right at the start, and there are a few things in which have been incorporated into the design of Snapchat, which is still kind of core. So we're 13, 14 years old now, and I think we've kind of evolved during that period. For Snapchat, we've always been primarily about messaging and having people on your friends list who are people who you know in real life, and putting in place, for example, barriers to make it harder for people who don't know you in real life to kind of find you. And looking at kind of Australia, we have an office here in Sydney. We have brought in a trust and safety team based in our Sydney office. I think we're one of the few platforms that have taken that step. We also have a law enforcement operations team also based in our Sydney office, and as well as other functions. We have an engineering team, and we also have people who look after cybersecurity based here as well. I think this would be an interesting week, and I think we'll get into this over the course of the next hour. But we have kind of major reforms happening in security, in privacy. We did have a bill on mis and disinformation until recently. And of course, we have the proposed minimum age for social media for under 16 people. And I think moving into next year, especially as we enter into a space with like multiple layers of regulation, and here in Australia, we do have one of the strongest regulatory schemes for a range of policy areas, including in online safety. I think it's always important to make sure that as we kind of continue kind of reforming the laws that we have in place in terms of how we implement them, that we incorporate kind of the experts, we incorporate all stakeholder views, we provide the space for debate around them, and I think in relation to policy that affects young people, that we include them in the debate.
Wonderful. So I'm now going to turn to Huon Curtis, a consultant and the founding member of the Digital Resilience Network, I think amongst many titles, if I remember properly. You recently led a national resilience assessment of Australia's telecommunications sector. So I'd love if you could talk a bit about the findings from that assessment, and in particular, anything you observed that's relevant to our conversation here today.
Certainly, thanks very much for having me. It's great to be back at ASPI. I moved here to Canberra in the middle of the pandemic and worked at ASPI on a big project about how defence engages with Indigenous Australia. That report was called Building Genuine Trust. And trust has been a kind of common feature of my work, and certainly within this domain of telecommunications resilience. I'm also doing some work for an organisation called CI-ISAC, which is a threat intelligence sharing and analysis centre that's trying to boost the way in which sectors share threat intelligence sharing across the ecosystem. Before that, I worked in the university sector for a long time, including most recently at ANU, where I conducted this telecommunications resilience assessment. That work was a whole of nation exercise in trying to understand what resilience means in telecommunications and really trying to form the coherence that you mentioned across a wide range of stakeholders and to find a common sense of purpose about what we might achieve all together. In that sense, and this kind of relates to the wider context at the moment with the release of the cyber strategy, the cyber bill today, there is lots of room for us to institutionalize and make routine the way in which we learn lessons from disruption. And that was a common feature in the work that I did in telecommunications. Telecommunications is a sector where everyone is pointing to everyone else saying, we're resilient, you're not doing your piece of the pie. And my role was really to coordinate all of those interests to try and bring them together to tell a common story about what they might do. I think the other thing that came through very strongly in that was the dimension of shared responsibility between different actors across the ecosystem. It's not sufficient in this day and age for a leader to say, that's not my responsibility. We've seen instances of that in recent history of people blaming others, and then they suffer the electoral consequences if they don't go beyond the bare minimum. And I think that's, again, something that has come through with the cyber bill today, is that it's trying to institute better mechanisms where we learn, we foster continuous improvement, and build a sense that it's not good enough to point to someone else. The telecommunications work was really an exercise in herding cats, in trying to find what that common purpose is amongst all of those players. You have very rusted in positions of both industry and government that sit across from the table from one another and accuse each other of not doing the right thing. So really what the assessment required was pushing both industry and government further than they were prepared to go, where industry often overinterprets the limitations that exist within current legislation about information sharing, and then government has particular views about both, we're talking Australia, the federal government at this point, about what states and territories want. They're coming for, a handout. Same with industry, and that their job is to bat that away. But there was a consistent story there throughout the work that the government, the federal government, needs to find that coherence and provide that coherence across industry. And I think there is dimensions of that with this cyber strategy. I think it's the cyber bill, rather. It's a step forward. I think another mechanism, and it relates to being around the same table rather than across it. A part of that research was to hold a scenario exercise. So rather than having people sitting across the table, we had them around the same table, recognizing that we face a common threat environment, and that it serves no one for one part of the ecosystem to be left out of that capability development. Once you ramp up the pressure, and that's what we did. We pulled out the cords, said that networks were failing. Then we started to see those positions, the reluctance to share information, start to be uncovered. But then at the same time, we also saw industry were able to see some of the assumptions that were held in government, and vice versa. So government players, for example, said things like, can't you just all sit around with your competitors and share information around your natural disaster preparation, your cyber preparation? And people in industry saying, well, why? Like, that's never been the case. And if we did do that, it would be with lawyers in the room. And that is a feature of our environment. Same with the industry players. They were saying things like, when you ask us for information around things, we need to understand what the purpose of that is so that it can go to building some feedback loop with us to serve some kind of greater purpose. And so you started to see those kinds of ways in which industry and government and community, because I think that's the other dimension of this question, particularly when we're thinking about this under 16 ban, that the way in which policy is constructed, the people that are in the room, that need to be in the room, we need to broaden the parts of that are there. So yeah, that was the basis of that, and I can talk more to some of the other aspects throughout the throughout the evening.
Not morning anymore. So last but absolutely not least, I'm going to turn to John Coyne for opening remarks. John is the Director of National Security Programs here at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. John, in your work at ASPI, you've been involved in discussions around law enforcement challenges related to online security. In fact, you recently wrote about this. How do you see the current landscape of online threats to young Australians, especially in regard to emerging technologies like AI? And what role do you think law enforcement should play in balancing all of these interests that we are talking about here today for young Australians?
Look, good evening, everyone. I will get to those questions. I spent 25 years working in intelligence and national security, a large portion of that in intelligence collection disciplines, including psychological operations. So I've done mis and disinformation. About 10 years running intelligence with the Australian Federal Police across a range of different areas, and the last 10 years here at ASPI. Before I was planning today, and I said to Henry, who works with me, he goes, "Oh, what are you going to say, John?" I said, "Oh, I've got to do two things. I can either go really safe or I can be controversial." And so the really safe thing with all of this to turn around and say to you, with all of that said, is that look, technology is really complex. It's going to produce a number of different really interesting challenges going forward that we'll have to approach in a really agile, collaborative manner. The next thing up with that is that how do we respond in terms of privacy? And I've got to be really safe there and say, all we've got to do is balance it. Always keep in the mind balancing. I think I would be better served today poking a few little holes and myth busting in answering that question. We have a habit, first off. So here in Australia right now, we're talking about youth. There's not a lot of youth in the room, and I'm most definitely not youthful. Right now we've got a bill up there that's going to make sure that kids under 16 can't be on social media. So that's a Labor Party thing. In Queensland, we have the Liberal Party who are saying, real crime, real time. And then we have the Greens Party who's saying we should reduce the age of voting to 16. So when we get into all of this, it seems not going to the global landscape, the Australian landscape, we've got a bit of a wobbly board over what is and isn't our young people can do, can understand, can be responsible for. And I don't have an answer to that, but the fact that we're not having a conversation around that makes all the other bits even more difficult. The second component, it's really easy to sit in a room like this, and Ben, I'm not doing it to you, but it's to say, enter the corporate name, and all you say was just, it's these corporate types. All we need to do is ratchet down on them. For over a decade during my time with the Australian Federal Police, on innumerable times, big tech, despite not having to, provided direct assistance in investigations in terms of child exploitation material. Companies like Google in the early days assisted us with developing artificial intelligence to do data matching and face matching, that's saving officers huge amounts of time from having to look at image after image after image. So big tech, they make a profit, but certainly, they're not necessarily the big bad wolf in the room on this either. Ben described it, and I could probably, a number of different large companies come through. They want to talk about all their compliance work they do, etc. But also when we're talking social media, this stuff ranges from small startup companies in places like Silicon Valley who have 4 staff members, 2 staff members with a really great idea, and they don't have the commercial capacity to comply with a lot of the legislation that's put in. And then at the other end, one of the competitive edges in all of this is privacy and encryption. So we're asking people to go against the very marketing model they're doing. My experience in prohibition, and I'm on the record for it, so I should be the arch conservative in these discussions. Prohibition rarely ever works. I can talk about illicit drugs, or I can talk about a range of illicit tobacco in this country. Legislation in that way isn't the answer necessarily either. And certainly, anyone who knows or has young children in that either tweens or teenager years, if you don't think that they're going to be able to find a VPN quicker than you can do anything about it, you really are quite deluding yourself. So I think we have a far more complex problem here than what we actually think we have. And I think the starting point of it, you stole my line, and I don't like it. I'm always for education and critical thinking, and I think that is the first. I think programs for parents, like in this country, like Think where kids are educated on these sorts of things and their parents, I think these programs do more good than anything else. So my final component of all this is in that same prohibition model. The investigation model works really well if, okay, for a second imagine, I come out the front of your house, you're standing there and the mail person comes through, puts the mail in your mailbox, and I pick up and run across the street, I grab your letter and I run down the street. So you ring the police. The police come there and they take a description. They look through their criminal indices and they records and they go, yeah, well, look, there's a bald-headed, grey-haired, grey-bearded guy who steals mail in this suburb. We'll go see him. They look in, knock on the door. They see the envelope there. The evidence is there. It goes to court. I'm prosecuted. And something happens. We try and introduce that same model for an environment where it doesn't actually match up. So we're seeing this New South Wales Police's reporting of cybercrime increases like 25% every month. That's ranging from, someone doesn't send me my eBay product all the way through. So that investigative, prosecutorial, legislative model doesn't work either. So it has to be in the prevention, and it has to also be in the disruption. And whilst we all want a retributive approach, I'm not sure that that's going to work. And I do think we're better off working with, and it's a final component, with the major corporates. And normally I'd sit there and roll quite a few off who are doing it, but I'd seen that all here today. I think it'd be inappropriate, but exactly described here by Ben in terms of what Snap's doing. I think that is a far better outcome than putting a 16-year-old ban on on social media, which may or may not be technically feasible. And I might add, if we have to actually prove every user is 16 years or older, that means all those tech companies are going to hold a hell of a lot more of our personal data. So I've thrown some controversy out there. If Henry's in the room, he'll be happy.
You want to? Yeah.
I was just great comments. I was just going to add a little bit to that. I mean, everybody in the audience and online comes to this, and listeners come to this from maybe knowing about a part of the problem and not other parts of the problem. And I just sort of wanted to allay any fears that Australia is really no different to any other country in the world, and that the studies done on young people in Australia really match with America, France, Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom. And we know that approximately sort of 51% of young people experience bullying online. We know that 1 in 3 women, 1 in 3 young men and 1 in 2 young women experience unwanted sexual content online, and 44% of that has happened in the last sort of 12 months. We know from young people, and I wish that we had some in the room today, that their top 3 worries online are exposure to inappropriate content. They don't want to see it. They don't want strange people in their environments where they want to hang out with young people and have a good social positive time in those spaces. We know that their second top fear is cyberbullying, and we know that they're really concerned about their privacy and their data. So they are a smart, savvy group, but just like anything in what we call the real world, I mean, I've been in this game for 15, 16, 17 years now, and adults in the room still talk about it being online and offline. It's not, it's just the world. So we know that they're interested, but just like any other risk in the world, it needs good parenting. And when I was at the Australian E-Safety Commissioner, we always used to talk about parents being the first line of defence. And we always used to talk about, with my AFP colleagues at the time, that we're never going to arrest our way out of these problems. And that's why prevention is the best way forward. I'm still in the undecisive category of whether this social media ban, which side of that fence I fall on yet. And I think a lot of people probably are. And I think that if it comes in, there'll be unintended consequences. And I think that it probably deserves more debate and more consultation to get to the best version of it that we can, if it is something that we are going to legislate.
Thank you all. I kind of want to take everything you said and create a little bit of a map, because I think we got the infrastructure layer, where we need resilience, where we need to ensure that people are talking to one another and that we're able to continue to have connectivity throughout that level. We then have the providers who sit on top of the infrastructure level and are instituting policies, building teams, trying to respond to things. By the way, we all know that there are no young people in this room, because it was a very harsh reminder that Snapchat is 13 years old. I'm not sure we needed that reminder here on stage tonight. We then have the content that is shared over those platforms. Mis and disinformation, bullying, harassment, potentially. Also a lot of good content that a social media ban will prevent young people from getting access to. A lot of community, a lot of sharing things with one another, the things that they're sharing maybe on Snapchat. And over all of those things, we have the government rules, procedures, and policies that govern what can happen, how information can be obtained, if, in theory, people can get online, VPNs aside, assuming that people are going to follow the rules that are set. So it's such a complex environment. And several of you on stage have mentioned that we really need to have young people in these conversations. And so I want to poke at that a little bit within this complex environment, and what the best way is to, do we think, maybe to bring young people into it, to educate them on items that are a little more complex than just what data are you turning over when you download an app, perhaps, and get them more involved in policy discussions. that's open to whoever wants to jump in first.
I think the first step is policymakers and certainly people in this room and online. I listened to a presentation a little while ago where someone was talking about the heydays of the 80s and 90s and buying CDs and other things. And, it was a fantastic story, like sharing them, being outside and that sort of stuff. As a teenager in the late 80s, people were smoking cigarettes like it was going out of fashion. It was a wonderful time, but kids were also, in a range of dangers that they weren't, probably shouldn't have been exposed to. So I think there's always a danger of us looking back on rose-coloured glasses on the way things were, about people, kids running down the street and playing in parks together or outside for hours on end. So that aside, and that tongue-in-cheek reference aside, I think, it took me a while to get my head around this, which is, so if you're a teenage kid or playing Fortnite and, you've got 5 or 6 friends online, 3 of them you may never have met in person in your life, and they view them as just the same types of friends. And in fact, they probably speak to them more often than their other friends they see at school, after hours anyway, are the same types of friends. So they don't see that differentiation. So I think that first part of engaging is a little bit of soul searching around that integration between technology and lifestyle, and understanding that has changed for a new generation. So, if you had a cassette, then you went to a CD, and now, no CDs. Our generation, my generation, has come to terms with the idea that you don't have to physically own music, but we seem to find it hard that you can only have a friend if they're physically there with you. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing with this is that there is a greater opportunity through programs, whether they're Think You to Know, whether they're school programs, to really be able to give voices in that discussion. So at the moment, if you're a teenager, if you're a 13-year-old or 14-year-old who has access to social media, as I was saying before, the Queensland government is saying if you go and commit a crime and it's serious enough, you do a serious crime, you'll do serious time. And so they're sort of going, wow. At the same time, they've been told they're not mature enough, though, to be able to access what they want. So we need to actually sit there and allow them to have that voice in a formal thing. So I think, the consultative period for the current piece of legislation going through was far too short. It didn't allow the opportunity for young people to make comments on that. And I
Want to remind the room how long that consultancy period was?
I think it was only a week or 2 weeks.
3 business days.
3 business days, there you go.
3 business days.
So I knew it was short, but we need to empower that conversation, and it's no different. We rarely introduce legislation for other categories or people in our population in that same way without deeply consulting them. And I think so. To me, it has to be that this continuous engagement process, and on our side, as I said, a little bit of a wake-up call in terms of how we look at the problem.
Some very good advice I got when I was here at ASPI from Jill Savage, who was here until recently, was I was working on this issue about Indigenous participation in defence, and she said, make sure you get out of Canberra. And that was absolutely instrumental for me to be able to see the problem space in a very different way and to be able to incorporate that difference into the recommendations. And in that instance, I was in the suburbs of Townsville and over in Palm Island, seeing that kids were doing all sorts of naughty things with technology that they shouldn't have, getting beepers, overriding systems by pressing one number multiple times. But then when I came back to Canberra, I was at an event with Teachers Forum, and I was like, oh, look, I had this experience, just wondering what your students are like. And they said it is exactly the same in the suburbs of Canberra. And so that idea of difference, there are similar instances across the board. That is something that I took on board with the resilience work, because in that instance, and it's not in the social media domain, but it is related, we can't just think about what the telco operators do in their systems, because it is not their responsibility. They do have a responsibility for sure, but their responsibility is to communicate, for example, what their service level agreements mean, but it's not their responsibility to interpret that from the perspective of a hospital. A hospital has to sit there and go, is this the service level that we need? Do we need a backup in that system, given what our interpretation of that service level agreement is? And so it pushes slightly to the edges of what responsibility might mean, and it devolves some of that away from, in that instance, the telecommunications provider. It doesn't remove that, but it changes the aperture of what should be considered. And certainly that is a thing that I push very heavily to the government, that they can't just think about it in terms of what it is that Optus, TPG, Vocus, Telstra and some of those majors think about in their operations.
I love that point. I grew up in a very rural area. My backdoor neighbors were cows. And then coming and living in New York and DC later, it's such a different environment, but I do think that there are commonalities that spread through. And so finding those pieces where you can talk to people from different communities, but then getting exposure to those people is wonderful. Mandy or Ben?
I was just going to add, and it's something that a colleague of mine, she's sitting in the room today, Anna Alexander. I hope you don't mind that I've called you out. Anna has 4 wonderful children, and I asked her, as a parent of children across multiple ages, what they thought of the proposed social media ban. So I hope you don't mind me sharing this story. And she said that they largely thought that it was a bit silly, and that most of their online interactions actually happen in gaming. And so while I haven't worked at the coalface of this for a number of years, I looked up sort of the gaming statistics in Australia, and 60% of 12 to 17-year-olds are gaming, and it goes up to 80% if you're looking at the 17 to 24 cohort. And then there's not a huge disparity between young men and young women, 85% of young men and 65% of young women in those cohorts, and it's only increasing. And they're not included in this government proposal. So what is the government trying to achieve? And is it just because we can categorise easily social media companies, so we've grouped them together, where I would argue that we should be looking at what's the problem, what do we think the problem is, and then how do we solve that problem? So that's what I would add to that. I also think that we are quite good at consulting young people in education material. The Think You Know program that came from the crime agency where I worked in the UK, I managed the youth panel that around those programs, and that was right across the UK and Europe, and so it was intelligence led from that perspective. In Australia, we do the same thing, but we often coalesce young people from elite schools that have access to government bodies, and we put them in a room, and so there becomes a little bit of groupthink. And I would challenge people that are in a position to get young people in a room to get a diversity of young people, not just think that you're being diverse because you get young people. Yeah, there's just a few things to think about there.
I overheard some kids talking the other day about it, and they said, with age restriction and if disinformation is something we're concerned about, we should ban the over 60s.
100%, and that you've absolutely got a point, because the people that in the Australian e-safety studies, it tells us that the people that have the biggest problem with mis and disinformation are the over 55 category, and they're also the people in the room that have the most access to dollars to buy devices. And so you've got those two things colliding, and that there is a real intergenerational opportunity there, I think, for learning as well. So it's a really good point.
Yeah, it's not just program. Can you come and reprogram my VCR?
No, it's mum, get off Facebook.
Get off Facebook.
Don't believe that.
Yeah. Really interesting, and I think we should chat afterwards. Before my role at Snap, I did video game policy, actually, as it turns out. So a lot to discuss there. I think your question about young people and their role in policy is critical. I think young people often, and I don't want to speak for young people, but the young people that I do speak to, they don't always feel as though they're welcome in the conversation. Policy is often made in their absence. It's often made for them. And there are really kind of few opportunities realistically outside of actual engagement on social media for them to have a voice. I think it is really telling. You know, we had a 3 business day inquiry into this proposed minimum age for social media bill. Clearly, that isn't enough time for genuine and robust debate, and there were no young people who appeared at that half-day hearing that was held. But I do find it interesting that the other parliamentary inquiry into social media that has been running for the best part of the year, certainly the last half year, and to their credit, that parliamentary inquiry, which thoroughly interrogated social media. Snap appeared at a hearing amongst other platforms. They also spoke to young people. And I do think it is quite telling that that committee released its report, I think it was on Monday, and that report did not recommend this minimum age. In terms of how we go about it, I think you're quite right. There are a lot of government bodies and a lot of companies and NGOs create formal structures around how to elevate the voices of young people. Youth councils, young people advisory councils, young people working groups. E-Safety Commissioner has a youth advisory council. SNAP has one globally, and I would love to be able to bring one here in Australia as well. I do think we do absolutely need to avoid the risk of having a smaller group of young people who tend to have the opportunities to put their hand up. They'll hear about these councils, they'll put their hand up, and they have really important stories to tell, but there are others who are less engaged, further from the capital cities, and they don't necessarily, and especially if they don't feel as though there is a place for them on these councils or even just to be involved in these conversations, then of course it is less likely that they will find their way into rooms like this. So I do agree we need to, whatever we can do to think creatively about how we incorporate those voices in. And I do worry, assuming that the bill passes and the minimum age has to be implemented over the course of the next year, you are losing the ability for a lot of young people who currently are already kind of expressing themselves, finding their communities, finding their connections, and doing so on a range of platforms that might be cut off from them in the future.
So I didn't prepare you all for this, but I want to ask a very quick follow-up, which none of you have to answer. Because something that's been elevated in your remarks to me is we are kind of treating under 16s even as a body, which means we're treating a 7-year-old the same as a 16-year-old. And a ban is a blunt instrument. Is there any space here? Should we be discussing more distinguishing between different ages, even under 18, under 16? What are the different breakdowns that we should be thinking about?
I think the enforcement and regulation side, if you break it down, becomes almost unworkable when it gets down to those levels, and costly. I think, my gut feel is we still can't actually identify what the problem is, and that's where, how you can get good policy out when you're not sure what the problem is, and good legislation, it is really the fundamental in here. So, and the other part is, so you might say, well, a 7-year-old should never have access to social media. But the problem is in some parts of Australia, there are, which I know there's been a number of people who've raised this with me, there's single parents, separated parents who they've moved elsewhere. The only communication tool they have with kids is via social media. So we're going to take that away. If we do that, then what other platforms will we allow them to use? And again, it also comes back to, we already have a classification systems for games. The majority of the games that young teenagers like to play are probably not in the age classification. So I've got to be careful not to say them, and probably not at the age classification of teenagers. Yet they're on there, all the time and talking. So that, does it meaningfully, and can we even implement that? So I think that it has to go back to problem definition. And one of the good things about this event here is that you can't define balancing out, safety, privacy, and force all those things and achieve some sort of wonderful balance if you don't actually know what you're balancing it for. And I think that's where it's a good way to, where you have people with very different perspectives being able to come together and go, well, look, okay, these are the things we do and don't know.
Mm-hmm. Huon?
Yeah, I was just thinking of some work I did at one point for UNICEF, which looked at child-centered frameworks and seeing a child as an expert in their own lives. And in that sense, it's not about going, hey, look, here's the smorgasbord of stuff for you to play with online, but it is kind of actually seeing the child as an enabled, autonomous being that has its own sense of agency and a way to navigate the world, and that you want to facilitate that and enable that to the best, the best possible outcomes. I think that kind of thing might be a way of then, acknowledging that a 7-year-old is not a 16-year-old, that there's some kind of age-appropriate access to some of these things that can be part of the conversation. But we live in a populist moment where I'm not sure that is quite... That said, the other thing I'll say about that is that we're so used to kind of incrementalism that when something comes and it's a big change, I'm not sure whether we can actually recognise that whether it is an innovation or whether it is just, a kind of populist move. I mean, it's a very popular piece of policy. So maybe the government's onto something.
So I want to go to Mandy next. I'm going to do a quick... we will go to questions at some point. So I want to say to people in the room, if you want to start thinking about what questions you might have, to people online, if you want to submit questions, I actually have access to those questions because of technology. So I will get to see the questions that people ask online if you want to put those in. Folks here, if you want to think about things that you would want to talk to the panelists about. And Mandy, I think I saw that you wanted to jump in. I want to introduce one more question perhaps, and then you don't have to because I could have totally been wrong, which is there was so much debate this week between all of the different packages that did or did not get heard or did or did not get passed, or will not get passed. But there are still so many gaps that haven't been addressed that need to be. And so I want to talk about opportunities available in the policy space, in the technology space, just to think about addressing some of the topics that we have come up with today. And so if people have an idea of what are the opportunities that are out there right now for the different entities, the different layers that we talked about involved in this conversation.
Well, that is a big question, but I'm happy to take it. I think Australia, we're a young country, and we have, although probably some people don't agree, but we have one of the best banking systems in the world because we borrow from other parts of the world to form a system here. And I think that we're pretty good at going out and seeing what happens globally. And I'm not sure if we've done that in this instance or if anything is happening globally or if we're at the forefront of it. So I think that those discussions should be happening. I know that we're talking about young people today, but I think about my own experience online sort of in the last 12 months. And I think I was hit with the Medibank security breach, the Telstra security breach. I actually changed phone companies recently, and then I think there was an Optus one. So I'm assuming everybody with ill-conceived plans has my data. And so I think that there is need for regulation and reform, but it's just how quickly that happens and how comfortable we are with it as a nation. And, that's where I sit. My partner, he works for CrowdStrike, and I'm sure you all know who CrowdStrike are now because there was a huge incident earlier in the year. But I mean, he said to me, if the social media platforms want my data because it's the only way to protect young people online, I don't trust them with my data. I won't be using those platforms anymore. So then how does that shift the game again, you know? So I think that it sounds trite, but we just have to keep debating it to get to, there'll never be a perfect solution, but a more perfect solution. Yeah.
Anybody else on opportunities?
Look, you know what? I think there's a big opportunity around, I guess, in the education sector and training sector around this, and there's a big opportunity to reset around, you know, and I've been just doing some stuff in the UAE recently talking about AI literacy, you know, and so I do think that in these sorts of spaces there's a general lack of literacy in the discussions and the difference between functionality. So, you know, I hop in a platform and ask a question, you know, I'm going to get a question tonight, so, you know, what are the 5 things I should say? You know, that platform spits it back out, and I can then, there's a difference between that and perhaps really understanding the dimensions of how these things work, not at a technical level necessarily, but at another level, and understanding, secondly, you know, the ethics of those. And I think, to me, that is a far better mode to start with. I think the other opportunity here is to move the dial away from this hardcore regulatory punishment space to one which is focused far more on disrupting those that would do us harm. And I think that is the majority of people have a fantastic experience online, on social media, on using big data in terms of privacy. So, you know, I think that's, from that perspective, you know, there is a requirement to go, well, where is the disruption component? What are we trying to stop here? And I think that's where the real opportunity, and there is an opportunity in that space for the private and public sector to work together to find a solution.
I do have one opportunity that I thought about, actually, just as that you triggered. I think that we focus a lot on young people, but the support and enablement of our teachers and because they're the one that have to implement these programs, and they're my age, you know, and they didn't have, or older, and younger, but they didn't have the opportunity to have these same programs that young people have now. So I'd love to see our teaching profession have access to more resources around mis and disinformation. What does critical thinking look like? All of those things in an online space. Yeah, and with the AI as well, there's huge powerful opportunities with that. Monash, for instance, has AI Lex. It's artificial intelligence, law enforcement, and community safety, and looking at really novel ways to use AI to do child sexual exploitation disruption. So law enforcement officers don't have to look at images or image-based abuse over and over and over again. So that's that opportunity as well.
So Huon and then Ben?
Yeah, look, I think one's kind of a broader point about the cybersecurity landscape in general. Like, I think this is about the bill and what it puts in motion. Like, I think we're still in quite an embryonic moment in terms of our cybersecurity posture in general. And like, if you think about, like, over the last 18 months, like the ACSC has come out multiple times saying, can you please share with us whether or not you've been attacked, despite the fact that they've, you know, communicated in a reasonably clear way what would be done with that, the rate of sharing has decreased. So, like, the sense of opportunity that there is, like, it's in the forum, the format, the sense of a two-way street between what is given into whatever entity exists and then what's shared back out. Like all of that stuff is still kind of ripe for the picking, and I don't actually think that we're really at a moment where, I mean, I think we need to continue those conversations, but like, the time is to take some big steps forward.
Ben?
If I could answer both of your questions.
Yes,
One each.
absolutely.
So on the first one in relation to like age groups.
Yes.
So another piece of my background was that for a few years, I ran policy and research for the Australian government's classification and censorship scheme. And that involved a lot of, like, the national classification scheme, it's dated. It's probably ripe for some reform. And one of the reasons for that is, I think as we talked, we ran focus groups and we did surveys and we spoke to particularly parents from all around Australia, and we were starting to sense a lot more parents understanding the different ages of their teens and what was appropriate for them. There was no rule book around this. And this has also come up in some of the debate around the under 16 proposed ban. And it actually came up in the social media summit, which I went to. And there was someone on stage who, was not a fan of social media, but not a fan of the ban for a certain age either. And one of the reasons was that a content may be appropriate for one 15-year-old, it may be appropriate for another teen who was 13, and it's really challenging to be able to find kind of a blunt tool that can really kind of accommodate that. On your second question, I think that one of the bills in which one of the many bills currently kind of going through Parliament is the amendments to the Privacy Act, and I think with the proposed privacy reforms, one of the recommendations that made its way into this bill is for the creation of a children's online privacy code. And I think from our perspective, and it might be a little bit odd kind of hearing it maybe from someone who works for one of the larger platforms, but it's something which we've been supportive of right from the review of the Privacy Act itself. And I think it can play a really important role over the coming years to really codify what we think are their expectations around how the data of young people should be treated, and there's an opportunity to get everyone on the same page and to set some clear ground rules and really help the broader public, I think, understand these issues a little bit more closely, and to have a regulator there who is an expert and is able to come in and really assert its presence in this space.
So I want to introduce one more topic before we turn over to questions, and it's actually to interrogate something Huon just brought up, which is cybersecurity very specifically. There was a report, I believe I actually first read about this in the ASPI newsletter, so a plug for the ASPI daily newsletter, which I find to be very helpful. But recently there was a global competitiveness study that ranked Australia 46th out of 67 in terms of global cybersecurity, or government cybersecurity. However, one of the things that got passed this week was a cybersecurity law to try to respond, I think, to some of that, or will respond to some of those concerns. So just a two-part, which folks, you can answer one or both or neither, is what impact that law will have more generally on this conversation and on the cybersecurity posture for young Australians in Australia. And then second, what impact will it have on the broader concept of what we're talking about, on the safety concerns, on the privacy concerns, potentially, in particular, absent privacy reform, in case we don't get that this week?
Let's go first. I can go first. Yeah. So one of the big features of the telecommunications resilience piece that I did was the lessons learned component. So the framework that we came up with was focusing on risk management, consequence management. So that's where you try and think about the impact of an event and then minimizing the impact or harm that might occur. And then the lessons management, how do we learn lessons and then and move beyond that, and then change, and how would you measure change from that? And the thing that was put to me frequently was that we can't afford to have a Royal Commission any time an outage occurs. It's not a like, of course, there are major disasters, but not a particularly efficient way of governing society. And so making more routine the kind of mechanisms of sharing information in different ways, I think is a really good way forward. In the critical infrastructure sector, as I said, there's an extreme reluctance to reveal your vulnerabilities, and in some respects, the kind of thing that I was trying to encourage people to do is to sit around and talk about our joint vulnerabilities, which kind of sounds like a little bit like an Instagram influencer, but but that's kind of what is required. Like, there is the case that, and again, like this is, one of the organisations I'm working with is trying to think about those mechanisms that can exist to build capability across the ecosystem. Earlier this year, the Home Affairs put out a tender for a health information sharing and analysis centre, an ISAC, to try and boost the capability of the health sector, which remains one of the most frequently targeted areas of for cybercrime and intervention. So an ISAC then is outside of government, so you don't like information goes in, but then it's not governed by the confidentiality mechanisms that are in place for top secret things. It can then recirculate back and inform different entities that this is something that they might be also experiencing, and these are the actions that they might be able to take. So some of those mechanisms, I think, in a slightly different way to the privacy components, but it is also tackling the contours of what constitutes effective information sharing and what might be commercially sensitive versus what and have some national security dimensions, and then what actually then might circle back to increase our preparedness, and then in so doing make sure that we actually increasing our deterrent capacity, because if we boost that cyber ability, then we become less of a target, and it means that it becomes the kind of money that's spent on cybersecurity, is well spent, because then you're not paying ransomware payments or whatever the case might be. But all of those things about the format, the forum that's appropriate, and I think what we want to limit is the amount of information that might go into government and never come back.
Well, look, I don't think in this case, one of the challenges we've got is obviously the rate of the cyber threat, or how it changes and evolves, is spinning like this. On the other side, legislation at best spins like this. So it's a two-speed process. There's a gap between what's regulated and legislated and then implemented, of course. And that gap, unfortunately, appears to be getting wider and wider over time. When it comes to the private sector, it really comes down now to corporate risk. So, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we wouldn't find cyber risks being treated. Now I'm talking broadly across boards of private sector companies, and certainly here in Australia, paying attention as a board issue. Now, all of a sudden, it's a massive, over the last several years, become a massive board issue. And the board itself will sit there and take it in because of the value to shareholders, its risk, both tangible and intangibly to the organisation. I was asked in a conference 7 or 8 years ago about handing up data over, and they said, why would you hand over data to a private sector? I said, well, why would you hand over data to government? Because for most private sector and tech companies, their ability to move in terms of dealing with cyber threats is actually quite fast in comparison to bureaucracy. So, we keep on returning back to legislation and regulation like it's a magic solution to all of this. I'm less convinced that what it really is what changes do we need to motivate in this space. So, I said I'd spent 25 years in intelligence. Last 10 years in national security. Last 10 years, I've tried to leave all that cynicism and pessimism behind and be sort of, really positive in the think tank space. But if your question is, will this regulation be magical and change everything? I'm afraid not. I don't think it's going to move the dial much at all.
I can say in all of my time, I've never seen magical legislation before, although I aspire to maybe one day. Go ahead, Mandy.
It's probably not a space that, I go super deep on, but I guess my comments on the new legislation would be that the intent is correct in protecting Australians, and we're becoming more at risk every day in a contested world and geopolitical changes that are happening, and we know that it's nation-state actors that are responsible for lots of the attacks that happen on the major Australian companies, and there's a reason for that. So the mandated reporting around whether those companies are paying ransom payments or not is important for our intelligence community. So I think that there was measures in that act, I think, around minimum safety standards for IoT or Internet of Things, fridges, smart TVs that are in your house, all sorts of things. So minimum requirements for those to protect Australians, and what do those supply chains look like? So, we've really run the gamut today on everything from cyberbullying right through to what's happening on a global scale. So I think the intent is there, and we'll have to see now whether or not those things make a difference and how much of a difference. But I also agree with your comments. So it's just a really complicated part of the world, yeah.
It strikes me that when you think about IoT, the next generation of tech, these big headsets that people are wearing around, I saw one recently on a large billboard in Melbourne, are actually, they're predicted to be a large Christmas gift this year, and the giant safety or security standards for IoT might help for folks who are investing in that next generation technology. Anything else from up here? So I think that means we turn to all of you, and you get to be kind of an honorable part of the panel for a little while. There is a microphone in the back. Does anybody have a question that they want to ask?
Thanks, everyone. Is the bill relating to under 16s and social media, is that more to do with encouraging an uptake in the My ID, digital ID than any of the issues raised tonight? And if so, how vulnerable would it be to a cyber attack?
I don't think it's, my personal viewpoint, and it's just a personal assessment, I don't think it is related to that. I think it's related to a general push from government in relation to an emerging problem that worries a range of parents across Australia who are sitting there going to local members where it's being written up in media that social media, it's the terrible incidence of the number of children who have committed suicide in the country as a result of online cyberbullying. And, at the moment, in terms of politics and in this country, which is, this news cycle raises these very important issues. And so when we see bright young girls and boys at 13, 14, 15, on a fairly regular basis, it seems, of late committing suicide, that's going to get policy moving forward really rapidly, and that's what I think it has. I think that the digital ID isn't related to that, and quite often pieces of legislation and policy, I try not to be cynical and pessimistic, gets forced through in silos. And this one here has gone through fast because media is hanging on to these images.
I would agree. I don't think that those two things are connected at a policy level. I don't think that's what they're trying to do with this. I think that you're correct in saying that it really worries parents across Australia, brown parents across Australia. The Australian Federal Police received something like 60,000 reports to their tip line last year on sexual exploitation of children. We're seeing an increase in young people committing suicide and at a younger age. And I mean, it makes my skin crawl, you know, and I'm still sitting here saying, well, is this blunt instrument the right thing? And I think that there are some people in the room that say, well, we've tried everything else, and we have to attack it and take a big step forward, you know, and I think that's what it's about. And it's popular amongst Australians. And from a democratic point of view, you vote a government in to enact legislation that the country wants. So, you know, there's two sides of a coin. Yeah.
And just going back to that point I raised about shared responsibility, it's kind of making a mark in the sand to say shared responsibility isn't that, you know, okay, we're all online, you know, we've got our own ability to monitor it, but it's actually the platforms that have the main resources and main power to change stuff, and it shifts the burden of responsibility onto them, because they're the ones that then now have to come up with some kind of verification regime.
One thing I will just add to that is FPF has published an infographic earlier this year, publicly available, on different methods and means to do age assurance, and talking about the different trade-offs in each of them. Because I do think age assurance is an issue where, in pursuit of safety, you can create significant privacy and security risks. And it largely depends on how you do it. And so the devil here might be in the details of how this gets rolled out. We have seen significant risks come from different identity programs. So we'll have to see what ends up happening. But you do want to make sure, like, there are basic privacy and security principles: limit retention, limit collection of information. And so programs that require you to collect and retain information can create more significant risks.
Hi, thanks for getting us together tonight. I broadened my fear after hearing all this. I knew about it, but it's a massive subject. I think with the rolling out of devices, probably started back with iPhones and iPads and things. That's the tool with which this stuff gets transmitted. So we have on one side like an addiction to these devices, and the other side is what's on them and what are they doing. So, you know, my concerns are about my kids I have no idea what they're doing on their devices, and they're on them all the time. Stuff like identity theft. So the banks and all those places are increasing their security to try and make sure you don't get ripped off. But at the end of the day, I've known people in NSA before, and it doesn't matter what you do, they can crack into your stuff. They can open up all your phones and record all your conversations and take all your data. You know, if I mention gold Rolex on my, sitting near my phone, tomorrow I'm going to get ads popping up with gold Rolex. They can get in and do anything they want. So they could take all your money or whatever. At the end of the day, it's possible. So if this technology and technique is transferred from the military level to the everyday criminal who's in Pakistan or Sydney or Canberra or Nigeria, we're in a lot of trouble. And I don't see it calming down. I think it's going to get worse and worse. So the big picture in the long term, we're looking at Band-Aids here. But this is quite serious. It really is getting out of control. And I initially thought my crazy friends who didn't go on Google and didn't do this, they're actually the smart ones now. So abstinence, control, and I think John mentioned is prevention or precaution. So where's this going to be in 15, 20 years' time? And I'm curious, John, with your security background, what do you think?
Look, this I'm not. I'm less. When I was saying pessimistic today, I was being very pessimistic about legislative responses. For years, for the last 10 years at ASPI, every time there's a terrorist incident involving an airport, I'm asked the question, can you ever make airports safe? I'm like, absolutely. It's a no-brainer. I can make you an airport that's perfectly safe today. Don't let any passengers there. Don't let any baggage go there, and don't fly any planes. And I tell you, you will find that is the safest airport ever. And they say to me generally when I do that, which is, oh, you're being silly. And I'm like, no, well, everything after that is a compromise for how you operate that. So, you drive a car, you drive down the road. The minute you leave your house, apartment, wherever, it's a compromise and risk. There's a whole heap of things put in place. So I don't think it's as pessimistic as that. There can be no doubt. And cars are probably a good example. If you go back to even the 70s, there were no seatbelts in cars. You didn't have to have car seats for your kids. People, goodness knows, a ton of parents sat and smoked in cars. So, I guess in this stuff of risk, we've got to keep on putting it in place, putting it in context. And to me, so if you ask me, is 15 years apocalyptic or is an existential threat? Look, I don't think so. I have a confidence in a range of agencies. And indeed, it's bad for business, for the private sector to allow en masse, and you saw this with Optus and others, to allow your data to be breached. So right now, that they will be, and there's an equation or a calculation that goes with it. So, if you're a bank and you're looking at your reputational loss, fines, everything else, how much you're going to put in place to remediate and mitigate risks. But overall, I think it's heading in the right direction. I've been tongue-in-cheek, well, not tongue-in-cheek, I've been a little pessimistic today, but, with the right amount of legislation and regulation, we will get there. Will it be challenging? Yes. Will there be those, and in every sphere of work I've done against adversaries, be they criminal, be they militia, be they insurgents, be they terrorists, over the last 25 years and then the last 10 years here, they always get innovative. So, you put something here, they change it and they move in a different direction. So it's a game of evolution. And we're evolving with that. What we want to see here, though, is the right evolution. So we don't want to, this whole conversation here is about, if you put blanket things. So I as sure as I'm sitting here, you blanket ban 16-year-olds from social media. I do not think that it will have a market impact because it's not the right approach to go. That's my personal opinion. So that's what this is about. But if you're asking me, are there people on that hill right now who have their mind set on trying to find the right solution to these problems? Yep. Are there people in a range of agencies across Canberra right now who are doing so? I think so. So I don't think it's apocalyptic quite yet. I don't see those indicators. Could it get worse at times? So could we see those spikes? Yeah, I think, we'll probably have a number of controversies over the years, and it'll spark massive legislative and regulative change, and it'll make a change in that calculation on risk. But we shouldn't be, I guess I'd hate to think that anyone walked away physically from this room or online going, it's the end of times for our children or that sort of stuff. Or I shouldn't, it's going to get significantly worse. I think that people are coming to terms with that problem. It always takes us a while to catch up with that.
Yeah, I completely agree. The only thing I would add to that, just to complement it, is that I've always believed that, and lots of people believe this, that technology is agnostic, and these are human issues, they're behavioural issues. And so taking a device off a young person isn't actually giving them the exposure or the education opportunity to navigate a more complicated world. And so it is on us as parents or as adults in the room to take on that responsibility and treat it no differently to anything else in life, and to guide and to shepherd and to educate and help grow a young person that is resilient in this world. And I also think that young people, from my experience, are the most socially emotional generation that we've had, and the most connected in terms of what they want the world to look like. And you may sit in the room and think that's naivety, but when you were that age, you were probably that way too. So we have to trust in that, and that they want good outcomes for themselves, and that they want to be a part of that.
And I think could I just add one point? Sorry for jumping in. One thing we haven't sort of talked backwards and forwards. So all this we're talking so far about enforcement and everything else. Let's not forget that this technology isn't. You said it was not. It's agnostic. It's definitely agnostic, but it's also of significant benefit to us. Look, I've got extended family, and you might say, well, social media. I've got an extended family who I can keep in contact with through minimal effort, which is great. You know, they're not watching right now, but you know, but you know, like, and I laugh about it, but you know, look, I can, you know, when I'm traveling the globe for work, I can every night I can talk to my son online, okay, through one of these. You know, I have the capacity of just about working anywhere I like. I can do banking. I don't have to go to, you know, these days I don't have to take my card with me. You know, I just sit there and take my phone, buy coffee, I can transfer money, all those sorts of things. So technology, and that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but in all of this, you know, whether we're talking AI, we're talking big data, these things have fundamentally changed the nature of our life. And those are very positive things. Now, like all positive things, they have a downside at times. And I normally say this about policy. We have a number of very senior politicians who come in here at various times. I always sort of, with many have this thing, you know, most people, politicians really looking for, they want a 100% solution from their public service and their policymakers. Rarely in complex problems these days are there 100% solutions. So then the old 80-20 rules comes in. It's like, okay, you know, if we'll find an 80% solution, that's probably close to the truth. But what we have now is we'll find an 80% solution, but the other 20% isn't, from a policy perspective, isn't neutral. It's negative or unintended consequences. So 80% of good, this is on a good day, 80% of success, 20% negative or unintended consequences. So yeah, this is a tough policy environment, but in all of it, you know, we shouldn't forget that, you know, this year is not just agnostic. These things have fundamentally changed our lives. They've made many parts of our lives easier. And that, I think, is impressive.
So one of the things I think that goes to your question about change effectively, like, and looking to the future. So when I did this scenario exercise as part of this telecommunications resilience work, we brought people together and tested their response. 3 weeks later, the Optus outage occurred, and we saw in the real world what some of the stuff that we'd seen in a room play out. One of the things in that instance was that it was said to us in the course of the scenario exercise, telecommunications operators, other firms said things like, "What is the national coordination mechanism?" Which, for those who might not be familiar, is a forum that can be stood up in the instance of a national crisis. That might be an agricultural shortage, it might be a cybersecurity incident. And it is an opportunity for those affected to brief the nation about what is going on. So it's a relatively new feature in the landscape. At our exercise, people said, "Are we part of that? Can we access that? What's the point of it?" 3 weeks later, Optus was here. They were asked at the beginning of the day, "Do you want to be involved with do you want to brief the nation with a national coordination mechanism?" They still had that kind of rusted in view that sharing information about what was going on wasn't necessarily to anyone's benefit. But by the end of the day, they did do that. And because of all of the other operators saw, because on the day you had, because they hadn't briefed the nation, you saw people across the country, states, territories, other corporations, media, inundating everyone, inundating Optus with demands for a briefing about what was going on. So by the end of the day, they did brief the nation, and then that helped, their crisis management helped. I think all of the other telco operators were similarly alarmed seeing that, realising that they themselves could be in a similar situation, not knowing about something like the national coordination mechanism, etc. Over time, things like that are socialised, and that is one of the features of the cybersecurity bill, is to socialise those mechanisms. Some of them, you know, in a sector that hasn't encountered something like that before, it might be a new instance, but it is trying to create some of those innovative information sharing forums, and then create an environment where we can learn and circle back, and then reintegrate that into new formulas for improvement. it is, I think, operating under the assumption that people who are trying to attack us are sharing information amongst themselves. So what do we do on the other side of things to make sure that our own efforts are there? Some of it is actually in that socialization aspect, that we've got some forums that might be useful to brief the nation when something goes wrong. But then there are other things in the bill as well.
Ben, a couple minutes.
Yeah, I might just take a slightly different perspective and talk about what scares me a little bit. So I might just step out from my Snap hat and go back to, when I, worked in kind of cybersecurity and in criminal justice. Snapchat is not a new platform anymore. It's not a spring chicken. There's a lot of innovation happening right now. And Snapchat is not a perfect platform. And there are harms that are, being fought kind of every day on it, but it exists. I do worry about, a range of some of the other platforms that we're seeing, both in terms of messaging, but also in terms of their generative AI capabilities. And, I've, as a part of my role, and even last week, I was at the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation in Brisbane for kind of stakeholder meetings. And you hear a lot about some of the really scary platforms and services and actors that are kind of happening kind of all around the world. I do worry. When I talk to young people, they're not worried about, many are not worried about this under 16 minimum age at all. And there's a few reasons for that. And one is that they don't think it will work, but also I'll use a VPN, I'll get around it easily. But also, there are a bunch, if I can't use Snapchat to talk to my friends, I'll use one of the other chat apps. And there are, we're based in Australia, we'll comply with all the laws that are applicable to us. With many of these other platforms and other services, the reality is that many, if not most, that do not have an Australian presence may not comply. And also, they will not have the same level of investment that, for example, Snap has with an Australian trust and safety team and kind of in-app reporting and kind of structures and partnerships with NGOs and law enforcement and regulators in Australia. And that does scare me. My nieces and nephews are no longer teens, but there are other young people in my life, and there's aspects of that world out there that is a little bit keeps me up.
So we are almost at time. I'm going to go down the line and ask you all for, I used to say a tweet length response. I'll say a blue sky length response, or a short final comment addressing, there are a lot of folks tuning in here online. What is we talked in the preparation for this panel, we want it to be action-oriented. We want you all to be able to go out into the world with some idea. What is the action-oriented thing that you, after all of this conversation, would want to send folks tuning in out into the world with?
Yeah. Can I start?
Yeah.
I would like everybody in this room and online to go and talk to at least 2 young people about what they think about the proposed legislation, with no preconceived ideas. Just ask them the question, listen, explore it a little bit, and it might help shape your own mind about what you think. And it could be that they, I've spoken to some young people that think it's a good idea, that they wish that they'd had some more protections when they were growing up. And I've spoken to other young people that think that it's silly. So just have a conversation and see what you hear.
Engage with the complexity. Engage with the complexity of the social media and privacy challenge - it's not a law enforcement issue.
I think my tweet would be of a blue sky. What are they called?
I'm not going to say it.
Something about continuous learning. I think that, and it picks up on other people's thing, that you need to have a commitment to continuous improvement and learning.
If you have a strong view on a policy, engage in any consultation process, even if it's only 24 hours until you have to submit.
Thank you. Can you all join me in cheering for our panelists? They did a great job.